I'll start by saying that, by nature, I'm not a paranoid person. I'm level-headed, a skeptic at heart, and generally, I believe there's a rational explanation for everything. But when I look back on what happened that election night, I can't explain any of it. I just can't. It all started when I decided to take a volunteer shift as a poll monitor. I thought it would be an easy way to get a little extra cash and do my civic duty. They'd set up a small polling station in an old community center about 15 miles outside of town. It was the kind of place with peeling paint and squeaky floorboards, the lights flickering at random intervals. A chill crept into the building long before the sun had fully set, and there was an unnatural stillness to the air. But I shrugged it off. The room they had set up was bleak, just a few fold-out tables, cheap metal chairs, and a handful of ancient voting booths. I was stationed at the front, logging people in and making sure they had the right IDs. Most of the voters were friendly, if a little quiet. The place had a strange, almost oppressive silence. Even when people were chatting, the sound seemed to die out before it hit the walls. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it. I didn't know anyone there, and by 7 o'clock, the stream of people had slowed to a trickle. I checked the clock again, hoping I'd be out of there soon, but the hours dragged. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not with the people, but with the building itself. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me, but the room was empty. I started to notice that the clock wasn't ticking right, as if it slowed down every time I looked away. I laughed at myself for even thinking that, but when you're sitting in a dead silent room for hours, you start to feel like the smallest things are signs. Then he came in. The last voter. He was tall and thin, with a face like it had been stretched out too long. His eyes were blank. Not empty, but like they were looking straight through me. He handed over his ID without a word, and I couldn't help but notice his hands were freezing when he brushed against mine. I wanted to ask him if he was okay, but the words stuck in my throat. He looked at me for a long time before he finally walked into one of the voting booths. I checked his name in the system, and that's when things got strange. His record didn't exist. Not only was there no entry for him in our system, but there was also no trace of him anywhere. It was like he didn't exist, at least not on paper. The computer screen flickered for a moment, then went black. I glanced up, half expecting the man to still be there, waiting, but the booth was empty. At first, I thought he'd just left, but I didn't hear the door open or close. I leaned out of my chair, looking around, but the room was empty. Every corner of the room seemed darker than before, like the shadows were closing in. I stood up, feeling a sudden sense of dread. Something wasn't right. I checked my phone, hoping to pass the time and distract myself, but it was dead. I charged it before I left home, and it was at nearly full battery just a couple of hours ago. The lights overhead flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on fully. Instead, a dull, yellowish glow filled the room, casting everything in strange shadows. I could see the outlines of the voting booths, but they seemed warped. Taller, somehow. Like they were looming over me. The silence was different now, heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I decided to grab my things and leave. I'd fulfilled my shift, and there was no point in staying any longer. I grabbed my bag, but when I turned back toward the door, he was standing there again, the man from before. He hadn't made a sound. He was just out there, blocking the exit, his blank eyes fixed on me. My mouth went dry. I tried to speak, to ask him what he was doing, but no words came out. He just stared at me, unblinking. Then, very slowly, he raised one hand and pointed at the voting booths. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, as if he was under some kind of spell. Against my better judgment, I turned around to look. There was a figure standing in each booth now. I hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen anyone else at all, yet the booths were full. The people inside them didn't move. They didn't even breathe. They just stood there, silent and still, their faces turned away from me. A chill ran down my back. I turned back toward the man, but he was gone. The door was wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges. My heart was pounding. I wanted to leave, to run, but I couldn't move. Something held me there, rooted to the spot. And then, one by one, they turned. Each figure in the voting booths turned slowly to face me. Their faces were blank, hollow. No eyes, no expressions, just empty, featureless masks. They stepped out of the booths, moving in unison, their footsteps echoing against the walls. I backed away, bumping into the table behind me. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. They were getting closer, their empty faces fixed on me. I could feel something cold, something wrong, creeping into the room, closing in around me. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, the figures were gone. I was alone again, standing in the silent, empty room. I took a shaky breath, feeling the cold sweat on my skin. But then, I noticed something else. The clock on the wall was ticking backward. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to leave. But when I stepped outside, the world was different. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, and there was no sound, no wind, no birds, nothing. The streets were empty, the buildings dark. It was as if the entire town had vanished. I looked back at the community center, and there they were again, the figures, standing in the windows, watching me. Their faces were still blank, still hollow, but I knew they were looking at me. Somehow, I knew they'd always be looking at me. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the empty streets. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there, not with those things watching me. The silence followed me, pressing down on me with every step. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe days. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. All I know is that I'm still walking, still trying to find a way out. But every street leads me back here, back to that old community center. And every time I look, they're there watching, waiting. I can feel them now, closing in, getting closer every time I turn my back. And deep down, I know I'll never escape. I'll always be here, trapped in this endless night, with them.